The wind moved across the desert like a restless ghost, carrying whispers of the forgotten. Stories of warriors, mothers, and children whose names had long been buried in the sand. It scraped against the canyons of Arizona, dry and endless, where nothing grew unless it was stubborn enough to fight for life. Acacheta sat by a dying fire, her knees drawn close, her long black hair tangled with dust and ash. The flames had burned low, leaving only a faint glow that shimmered across her face, a face too young to look so tired. Her dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, watched the embers fade as if they held the answers to a question she no longer dared to ask. The fever had nearly killed her 3 years before. She still remembered the pain, the burning heat under her skin, the old healer's trembling voice as he told her father she'd never bear children. "The womb has gone cold," he said. "The fire of life will not return." Those words spread through the camp like smoke, suffocating whatever dreams she once had. The men turned their eyes away. The women pitied her in silence. To them, a woman who could not bring new life into the world was as good as dead. But Acacheta wasn't dead. She was breathing, and every breath carried the sting of being unwanted. When the rains stopped and the earth cracked beneath their feet, hunger settled over the camp like a curse. Horses grew thin, children's bellies swelled from starvation, and the once proud hunters traded their weapons for grain. One morning, her father called her to the fire. His face was carved from years of hardship, his eyes hollow with desperation. "There is a white trader in the canyon," he said without looking at her. "He offers salt, bullets, and a strong horse." Acacheta's throat tightened. "And what will he take?" He stared into the flames. "You!" The words hit harder than any blow. She wanted to scream, to ask if he remembered the songs her mother used to sing while braiding her hair, or the way she'd once carried water for him from the river. But the man before her was no longer her father. He was hunger wearing a human face. When the trader came, his boots left deep prints in the red dust. He smelled of whiskey and greed. He handed over a small sack of supplies and a shiny new rifle, as if that could measure the worth of a human soul. Acacheta stood still, her chin high, refusing to show fear. She didn't cry when her father turned away. She didn't beg when the trader tied her wrists loosely with a length of rope. She only lifted her eyes to the far-off mountains, the same peaks where her ancestors were said to dwell, and whispered to the wind, "If the earth still breathes, I will find my way home." The trader laughed, thinking she spoke nonsense. But the desert wind heard her. It carried her vow across the plains, through the canyons and dry washes, where even the crows seemed to pause in their flight. And somewhere far to the west, beyond the cracked horizon and the loneliness of men's hearts, the wind began to change direction. The first time Acacheta saw Red Mesa, it rose out of the land like a wound that refused to heal. Miles of rust-colored soil stretching beneath a sky too wide for mercy. The wagon creaked and swayed along the trail, every turn of the wheel grinding dust into her skin. The trader driving it chewed tobacco and hummed tunelessly, never looking at her. To him, she was a transaction already done. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sinking low, spilling gold across the hills. The air smelled of sage and cattle and smoke, the scent of a man's world. A tall figure stood near the corral, one hand resting on the saddle of a bay horse. His hat shaded his face, but even from the wagon, Acacheta could see he wasn't like the trader. His stance was calm, steady, not the kind of man who barked orders or reached for a gun just to prove something. "Mr. Danner," the trader called. "Got the girl I told you about." The man turned. The light hit his face. Hard lines carved by sun and grief, a beard flecked with gray, and eyes the color of old whiskey. He didn't step forward right away. He just looked at her, and she felt the strange weight of a man seeing her not as property, not even as pity, but as a person he didn't quite know what to do with. Silas Danner had lived alone for 3 years. The wind and the cattle were his only company. His wife, Clara, had died during a storm that tore through the mesa one winter night. He'd built her a cross from cedar and buried her near the cottonwoods, where the river bent west. Since then, he'd spoken little and laughed less. When the trader first mentioned bringing him a helper, a quiet girl, strong enough for chores, Silas had agreed out of necessity. He needed hands around the ranch, someone to keep the place from falling apart. He didn't expect a young Apache woman with fire in her eyes and dust on her cheekbones. She climbed down from the wagon without help, her wrists still marked from the rope that had once tied her. The trader grinned, waiting for Silas to inspect her like a horse. But Silas didn't move. He took off his hat instead, lowering his voice. "You can untie her," he said. The trader frowned. "She might run." "Then she runs," Silas replied, his tone flat as the plain. "But no one stays here in chains." The trader hesitated, spat tobacco juice into the dirt, and did as he was told. When the rope fell away, Akacheta rubbed her wrists and lifted her chin. For a moment, her eyes met Silas's. Steady, unblinking. He saw something fierce there, like the last spark in dying coals refusing to go dark. After the trader left, the yard fell quiet again except for the wind and a few restless cattle. Silas cleared his throat, unsure how to speak to her. "There's food in the house," he said, gesturing toward the cabin. "Water by the well. You don't owe me anything. You stay if you choose, leave if you want. But here..." He paused, meeting her gaze. "No one owns you." For a heartbeat, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Akacheta didn't answer. Her English was rough, but she understood the meaning behind his words. "No one owns you." They settled in her chest like a seed dropped into dry soil, waiting for rain. That night, as the stars rose above Red Mesa, Akacheta lay awake on a cot by the window. Outside, she could hear the lowing of cattle, the sigh of wind through the grass, and the slow, patient footsteps of the man who had freed her without knowing he'd done it. For the first time since the fever stole her future, she felt something unfamiliar. Not safety, not yet, but the faint stirring of freedom, and the memory of her own worth whispering back to life. The first week at Red Mesa passed like the whisper of wind through tall grass, quiet, steady, and watchful. Akacheta rarely spoke. The English words sat heavy on her tongue, and silence was easier than explaining who she was to a man she barely knew. Each morning, before the sun even stretched over the red ridge, she was already outside. The air was cold enough to sting her lungs, but she carried the water pails from the well without a sound. She learned the rhythm of the ranch faster than Silas expected. She fed the horses, mended the chicken coop, gathered dry sagebrush for kindling. Her small frame moved with purpose, not rushed, not clumsy, just a quiet determination that seemed older than her years. Silas watched from the porch some mornings, mug of coffee in hand, boots planted on the warped boards. He'd lost count of how many sunrises he'd seen alone, but now, for the first time in a long while, there was another soul moving through the morning light. Not out of duty, but out of the simple will to belong somewhere. One dawn, he found her outside patching an old shirt near the fence. The rising sun caught strands of her hair, turning them to copper threads against the blue sky. "You don't have to do all that," he said, his voice half a growl, half concern. "The place'll still stand if you let it be messy." Akacheta didn't look up. Her fingers kept stitching, neat and patient. Silence, she murmured, her accent soft but sure, is also a way to say thank you. Silas had no answer for that. He only nodded, then walked off toward the barn, feeling something he hadn't in years, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. By the second week, the cabin began to sound different. The lonely creak of wood and wind was replaced by the faint hum of a kettle on the stove, the snort of horses being fed, and sometimes, when she thought no one could hear, a low humming tune, one of those wordless Apache songs that rose and fell like the desert itself. At first, Silas thought it strange, but each time he heard it, something in his chest loosened, as if the house had been holding its breath since Clara died, and now it finally remembered how to exhale. One afternoon, he caught her sitting on the fence rail, wiping sweat from her brow, the stubborn rooster circling below like it was plotting revenge. She noticed his grin. "That bird's got the devil in him," he said. Akacheta's lips curved faintly. "He reminds me of home." "Mean?" "Proud," she said simply. It was the first time he'd seen her smile. A real one. It was small and quick, but it stayed with him long after she walked away. As the days turned to weeks, their silences began to change. They were no longer heavy with suspicion or grief, but soft, like the kind shared between two people who didn't need words to fill the spaces. Every night, the same sounds returned: the kettle whistling, a horse pawing at the ground, the creak of his chair by the fire. But now, there was also her quiet laughter from the kitchen, light and hesitant, the kind of sound a home makes when it starts to live again. And though Silas never said it out loud, he knew that something, or someone, had brought life back to Red Mesa. It wasn't just the woman mending his shirts or boiling his coffee. It was the way she carried peace, like a secret she was slowly teaching the land to remember. It happened on a wind-heavy afternoon, when the sky hung low and red dust clung to everything. Akacheta had been trying to bake bread, her first attempt since arriving at Red Mesa. She'd watched Silas do it once, his rough hands steady, his movements sure. But today, she'd misjudged the fire. The smoke came first, thick, black, and fast. It snaked up the chimney, filled the cabin, and rolled into the rafters like a ghost. The smell of burnt flour and ash spread through the air, sharp enough to sting her throat. Her heart jumped to her mouth. In an instant, she was back in another time, her mother's voice raised, a heavy hand swinging, the sting of shame. She froze, staring at the blackened pot as if it were a snake ready to strike. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. The door slammed open. Silas stormed in, eyes wide, scanning for fire. "Hell, what happened?" he barked. "I'm sorry," she cried, her voice breaking. Her hands trembled as she tried to lift the pot from the stove. I burned it. I didn't mean to." He reached her in 2 long strides and took the pot from her hands before she could drop it. Smoke curled toward the ceiling. "Easy," he said, coughing a little. "It's just bread." Akacheta flinched, eyes wide, as if bracing for the blow that never came. "I ruined it," she whispered. "I'll make another—" Silas set the pot down and turned toward her, his tone calm but firm. "Akacheta," he said quietly, "it's just bread. Nobody's angry." Those 3 words, "nobody's angry," hit harder than anything else he could have said. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't understand. For years, mistakes had meant punishment, pain, humiliation. But now, standing in this cabin with a man who only looked at her with patience, she felt something she hadn't known in years. Safety. Silas grabbed a cloth, fanned the smoke toward the open window, and glanced at her again. "You don't have to flinch every time something goes wrong here," he said. His voice carried that deep, gravelly kindness that came from someone who'd known too much loss to waste his life on anger. "There's no one waiting to hurt you." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat tight. When the air cleared and the smoke faded to a faint haze, Silas poured her a glass of water. She took it with both hands, still shaking. He lingered for a moment, then said softly, "You're safe here. Don't forget that." He left her there by the window, his boots creaking across the floorboards as he went back outside. But the words stayed behind, hanging in the air like sunlight through dust. Akacheta stared at the ruined bread cooling on the table, then at her trembling hands. Slowly, the fear that had ruled her for so long began to loosen its grip. She sat down, feeling tears spill silently down her cheeks, not from shame, but from relief. That night, she baked again. The bread was rough, uneven, a little too hard at the edges, but it smelled of something new. Courage. And when Silas tasted it later, his mouth lifted into the smallest, quietest smile she'd ever seen. He didn't praise her. He didn't need to. His silence said enough. Out on the porch, the last of the smoke drifted into the desert sky, and for the first time, Akacheta realized that not all fire destroys. Some fires, if you're lucky, teach you how to live again. The desert at night had its own kind of silence, the kind that made you hear your own heartbeat. The cattle had settled, the fire near the barn burned low, and the stars above Red Mesa stretched endless, scattered like silver dust across the black. Silas sat on an old crate by the corral, pipe in hand, smoke curling up into the cool air. Akacheta came quietly, her bare feet soft against the dirt. She carried a blanket over her shoulders, her long hair undone, catching bits of moonlight as she walked. For a moment, she just stood there, watching him, unsure if she should speak. "Can't sleep either?" Silas asked without turning. His voice was rough, but kind. She shook her head. "Too quiet." He chuckled. "You'd be surprised how loud quiet can get out here." He tapped his pipe against his boot and looked up at the stars. "Some nights I swear the sky talks more than most folks." Akacheta sat down beside him, tucking the blanket tighter. The air smelled of smoke and horses and something else. Peace. For a while, neither spoke. The wind moved through the sagebrush, whispering the kind of stories that never made it to paper. Silas finally broke the silence. "I used to sit out here with Clara," he said softly. "My wife. She loved the stars, said they made the world feel smaller." Akacheta looked at him, his face lined and weathered, eyes glinting in the firelight. "She is gone?" He nodded. 3 winters now. The storm took her. Left this place quiet enough to drive a man mad." He gave a tired smile. "Guess I never thought I'd hear laughter in this yard again." She turned her gaze back to the sky. "Where I'm from," she said, "we believe the stars are campfires of our ancestors. They watch, but they do not speak." He considered that. Maybe that's what makes them kind. They just listen. For a long while, that was all they did. Listen. To the wind, the horses, the crackle of the dying fire. It was the kind of silence that didn't hurt anymore. After a time, Akacheta spoke again, her voice low, carried by the night. "People say I am barren, empty soil, a tree that will never bloom." Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, "Sometimes, the land only needs a gentle hand to bloom again." The words fell between them, soft as prayer. Akacheta's eyes glistened in the starlight, and for a moment neither dared breathe. She smiled faintly, though it trembled. "You speak like a preacher." He shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just a man who's seen the desert turn green again when everyone said it couldn't." Something shifted then. Not sudden, but deep. A kind of peace, unfamiliar and fragile, settled between them. Akacheta drew her blanket closer, her shoulder brushing his arm. He didn't move away. They sat like that, two souls who'd lost too much, learning again what it meant to share silence. When the fire finally went out, the stars seemed brighter, closer. She tilted her head back and whispered something in Apache, words he didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. "What did you say?" he asked softly. She smiled. "I told the stars to remember this night." And in that vast, wordless desert, love found them, not loud or sudden, but slow, steady, and true as the land itself. The wind had changed. It came softer now, carrying the smell of wet earth and cedar after a rare spring rain. The hills around Red Mesa, once the color of dried blood, began to blush green in places. Small shoots of life daring to return. Time had passed quietly, the kind that slips through your fingers without you noticing. Akacheta rose each morning before the sun, same as always, but lately her steps had slowed. The chores that once felt easy now left her breathless. She'd stop halfway to the well, press a hand to her chest, and tell herself it was nothing. Still, she knew something was different. Then one morning, as she bent to light the stove, the world tilted. The room spun, her stomach turned, and she dropped to her knees. Silas found her moments later, pale and trembling, gripping the edge of the table. "Hey," he said, crouching beside her, worry sharpening his voice. "What's wrong?" "I don't know," she whispered. "The world moves when I don't." He helped her sit down, fetched water, and said he'd ride for the doctor in town. She tried to protest, the old fear of being a burden flickering across her eyes, but he was already saddling his horse. By afternoon, Dr. Ambrose Kent arrived, his beard white as the desert dust, his leather bag creaking with every step. He had been the only doctor within 50 miles since the war ended, a man more used to delivering calves than babies these days. He took one look at Akacheta's face and smiled kindly. "You look like someone carrying more than just worry." She frowned, confused. "It's just tiredness," she said softly. "The wind steals my strength." He chuckled. The wind's innocent this time. He checked her pulse, asked a few questions, then leaned back with that quiet, knowing grin old country doctors seem born with. "Well now," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Congratulations, Miss Akacheta. The land's blooming after all." For a long moment she didn't move. The words felt too large to fit inside her. Her hands trembled as they drifted to her stomach. "No," she whispered. "That can't be." Dr. Kent's eyes softened. "Miracles don't ask permission, dear. They just happen when you need them most." When Silas returned to the cabin, his boots still caked with trail dust, he found her sitting by the window, staring out at the glowing valley. She turned, tears shining in her eyes. "Silas," she said, her voice breaking, "I carry life inside me." For a heartbeat, he didn't understand. Then his breath caught. Are you sure?" She nodded. The doctor said so. He crossed the room in 2 steps and sank to his knees before her, rough hands covering hers. His eyes glistened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "You don't just save my life, Akacheta. You saved this land. You made it alive again." She laughed through her tears, a sound like rain after years of drought. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the hills, and for the first time, Akacheta believed that miracles weren't gifts from heaven. They were the proof that even broken soil, given enough love, could bloom again. The trail had been quiet for weeks, the kind of quiet that makes a man trust the horizon. Then one afternoon the silence broke. The steady creak of a wagon wheel, the jangle of harness, the hard slap of hooves on packed earth. Dust rose like a warning flag as a single horse-drawn rig crawled up the wash toward Red Mesa. Akacheta was on the porch, cradling a warm basin of milk, the baby's soft blanket folded at her feet. She felt the change in the air before she saw the wagon, a sour smell of whiskey and coin, the kind of smell that marked a man who'd traded more than goods in his time. The trader climbed down, his boots sinking into the red dirt, and his grin was the kind that didn't travel with honest work. "Thought I might stop by," he said, loud enough for the cattle to look up. His eyes roved over the yard, landing on Silas near the corral. "Heard you got yourself a bargain, Danner. Word travels." Silas straightened like a rope pulled taut. He didn't move fast, but he moved with purpose, the purpose of a man who'd learned what to protect. "What's your business here?" he asked, voice steady as the fence posts. The trader spat, the tobacco juice hot in the dry air. "Business is business. The deal was made." He nodded toward Akacheta, as if she were a bale of hay. "And if word's true that the girl ain't what they said, well, I got a right to settle accounts." Heat rose behind Silas's eyes. There was a hiss in the crowd of hens and the lazy cluck of a rooster, as if even the farm animals heard the insult. Akacheta felt the old coil of shame tighten in her chest. The memory of being bargained away came like a gust. But this time, the ropes were gone from her wrists. This time, there were two people who would not let her be treated like property. "You mean to take her back?" Silas said, each syllable a slow-burning promise. "You mean to make claims on what ain't yours?" His hand curled near his hip where wood met leather, but it didn't go for a gun. It was a man's hand shaped by seasons of work, not by the need to kill. The trader laughed, a bark of mockery. "I can—" he started, then stopped as something in Silas's face shifted. The rancher's calm snapped into a ferocious light, not the blind rage of a drunk, but the cold, clean kind that comes when a man crosses a line. Silas's fist met the trader's jaw with a brutal certainty. The man went down into the sand, winded and coughing, his coins and papers scattering like dead leaves. For a beat, the world held its breath. Then the trader spat, wiped blood from his lip, and crawled back to his wagon with a look that promised trouble. "You ever call her a thing again?" Silas growled, leaning over the fallen man. "And I'll bury you under this sun myself." The trader snorted and kicked at the scattered papers, then climbed onto his wagon and rode off, his pride bruised more than his body. The dust swallowed him. Silence settled back over Red Mesa. But it was a different silence, full of something like relief and a future. Akacheta had stood in the doorway the whole time, the milk basin forgotten in her hands. She did not step forward. She did not speak. But the old hurt that used to break her into pieces trembled and then steadied. The years of being measured and sold and shamed were still there, like scar tissue. But in that moment they did not define her. She pressed her palm to her belly, feeling the slow, certain life within. The baby kicked, small and insistent, as if answering a question she hadn't yet voiced. When the trader was gone, Silas returned to the porch, boots leaving prints in the dust. He didn't look at her like a possession redeemed, nor like a trophy won. He met her eyes, with the quiet of a man who understood the depth of what had happened. "You okay?" he asked. She drew a slow breath and let it out like a promise. "I will not answer violence with blood," she said, her English steady, her voice low but sure. "I will answer with life. I will make this place hold what they never gave me, a home. That is my answer." Silas's jaw loosened. He nodded once, respect in the motion. "Good answer," he said, "and you don't have to do it alone." Neighbors would whisper about the fight later. Some would shake their heads, others would smirk at the traitor. But for Akacheta, standing in the shade of the porch with the sun warming the back of her neck, something fundamental had changed. The chains of that sail, the trade that declared her worthless, lay broken in the sand. She had refused to let hatred become her weapon. Instead, she claimed the more stubborn thing, her right to live, to grow, to become. She turned and stepped back into the house where the smell of baking bread still lingered, and the baby's blanket waited like a small, bright future. In the doorway, she looked once more at the trail the wagon had taken, and to the far blue line of the mesa where the sky met earth. "If the earth still breathes," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "I will make it bloom." Spring crept into Red Mesa, like a soft secret whispered across the desert. The air that once carried only dust now smelled faintly of rain and new grass. The fields Silas had once called cursed began to green again, shy blades of barley pushing through the soil as if testing whether it was safe to live. Akacheta stood on the porch most mornings, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other shielding her eyes from the sunrise. The baby kicked sometimes, a small, insistent reminder that the world could still surprise her. Silas had built a rocking chair for her that winter, carving their initials, S and A, into the back with the same pocket knife he'd used since boyhood. It sat beside the porch rail now, smooth and steady. "For when the wind sings," he'd said, running a hand over the grain. "We'll rock the child to sleep right here." The days passed slow, gentle, like pages turned by the breeze. Silas worked the fields, mended fences, and checked the foals in the pasture, but his eyes always drifted toward the house, toward the woman who'd given his lonely land a pulse again. She moved slower now, careful and deliberate, yet her laughter carried across the yard like sunlight on water. By mid-March, the valley was alive. The barley swayed like waves, wildflowers burst along the creek beds, and the colts kicked up clouds of golden dust as they chased each other in the dawn light. Even the air felt changed, as if Red Mesa itself had begun to breathe again. One night, the moon hung low and full, silvering everything it touched. Akacheta woke to a sharp pain, then another, and another still. Her breath came quick. She whispered Silas's name. He was at her side in an instant, panic in his eyes though his hands tried to stay steady. "I'll fetch Dr. Kent," he said, but she grabbed his wrist and shook her head. "No time," she gasped. "It's now." The hours that followed stretched like forever. The cabin filled with the scent of wood smoke and sweat, and life trying to be born. Silas wiped her brow, whispered words that didn't need to make sense. The old doctor arrived near dawn, just as the horizon began to glow. "Almost there," he said, voice low and sure. "Breathe with me, Miss Akacheta. One more time." And then it came, a cry so fierce it split the silence wide open. Silas froze. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. No wind, no cattle, just that sound. The sound of life. He looked down, eyes wet, as Dr. Kent placed the tiny bundle into his arms. The baby's skin was warm, her fists clenched, her voice already strong enough to fill the valley. She's perfect, the doctor murmured, smiling. Strong as her mama. Akacheta lay back, tears slipping down her temples. Hope, she whispered. Her name is Hope. Silas knelt beside her, his voice breaking. Hope, he repeated, tasting the word like a promise. Outside, the first light of day spilled over the hills, painting the world gold. The sound of the baby's cries rolled through the valley like thunder announcing rain after a long drought. A declaration that the barren land, the broken hearts, and the old curses had all been undone. Silas held mother and child close and whispered, You didn't just bring life to me, Akacheta. You brought life back to this land. And from that morning on, every dawn at Red Mesa seemed to rise a little brighter, as if the desert itself remembered how to bloom. By late summer, the land around Red Mesa had turned the color of old gold. The barley fields shimmered beneath a sun that never seemed to tire, and the air carried that sweet, dry smell of dust and hay. Inside the cabin, the world was smaller and softer, filled with the quiet rhythm of a baby's breathing and the steady creak of the rocking chair Silas had built. Akacheta sat by the open window that afternoon, her daughter asleep against her shoulder. Little Hope's tiny hand rested over her mother's heart, rising and falling with each slow breath. Outside, cicadas sang their endless song, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk called across the canyon. The peace of it all was something Akacheta still didn't quite believe. For so many years, silence had meant danger. The calm before a slap, the pause between cruel words. But now silence meant warmth, the smell of coffee, Silas humming low as he mended harness leather out on the porch. She looked down at her daughter's sleeping face and felt something stir, a thought she'd carried for too long, one she'd never dared to speak aloud. Carefully, she laid the baby in her cradle and reached for a scrap of paper. Her hand trembled as she dipped the pen in ink. Writing in English wasn't easy. The letters didn't always obey her. But she wrote anyway, slowly, carefully, like someone planting seeds. My father and mother once told me I was worthless. But I made the desert bloom. I do not hate, for hate only kills what could live. I forgive, because I want my daughter to grow where love still breathes. When she finished, she sat back and read the words again. They looked rough and uneven, but they were hers, carved out of everything she had survived. Akacheta smiled faintly. She folded the letter, tied it with a thin strand of twine, and set it on the windowsill. Outside, the wind was picking up, warm and dry, carrying the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. She watched as it fluttered the edges of the paper, teasing it like a curious spirit. Then, with a sudden gust, the letter lifted and slipped away, out the window, across the yard, and into the wide open world. Akacheta stood, watching as it danced through the air, caught for a moment in the light before drifting toward the mountains. The same mountains she had once sworn to return to. A place of exile once, now a place of peace. Silas stepped inside, wiping his hands on a rag. Writing letters again? He asked, a knowing half-smile tugging at his beard. Just one, she said softly. To the wind. He glanced out the window, following her gaze toward the far ridges. What did you say to it? She smiled. That the past doesn't own me anymore. He didn't answer right away, just crossed the room and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Together they watched the wind carry her words away until they became nothing but a shimmer in the sun. Outside, the sky deepened to amber, and the light poured through the open window, laying gold over the cradle where Hope slept. The land, once barren and cruel, seemed to hum quietly around them, not with sorrow, but with forgiveness. And for the first time, Akacheta truly felt free. Night fell soft and wide across Red Mesa. The sky stretched open, a black velvet quilt stitched with silver stars. The air was cool, touched with the scent of juniper and warm earth still holding the day's sun. Inside the corral, the horses shifted quietly, tails flicking at lazy flies, their breath curling pale in the starlight. Silas sat on the porch with his daughter in his arms. The baby's laughter rose and fell, light as wind chimes, breaking the deep hush of the desert night. Beside him, Akacheta leaned her head against his shoulder, her dark hair brushing the flannel on his sleeve. They didn't speak for a while. They didn't need to. The kind of peace they'd built didn't come from words. It came from surviving everything that once tried to silence them. The fire in the yard had burned low, only glowing coals left, pulsing like the last heartbeat of a long day. Above them, the stars burned brighter than any lantern. Silas looked down at Akacheta, his voice rough but tender. "They buried you once," he said quietly. "Under lies. Under shame that wasn't yours." She turned her face toward him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "But love made me bloom again," she whispered. He smiled, not wide, but deep, the kind of smile that carried both gratitude and awe. He brushed a thumb over the baby's cheek. "Then this land ain't cursed anymore?" Out beyond the porch, the wind picked up, sweeping through the barley fields that now grew where nothing once could. The stalks swayed like waves, whispering their soft, endless hymn. In the distance, coyotes called, not in hunger this time, but like they too were part of the song. Hope, their daughter, reached out, tiny fingers grabbing the air as if trying to catch the stars themselves. Akacheta laughed softly, her heart full and steady. "She'll never know what it means to be sold or silenced," she said. "She'll grow where there's light, even if it's born from dust." Silas nodded. "You gave her that," he said. "You gave me that." They sat in silence again, the kind of silence that carries the sound of everything good. The whisper of grass, the creak of the rocking chair, the small breaths of a sleeping child. For years, this land had been nothing but red dust and hard memories. But now it was alive, full of laughter, growing things, and the quiet hum of hope. The desert hadn't changed overnight. It had simply waited for someone who believed it still could. The stars above flickered like they were listening. Akacheta closed her eyes and let the wind brush across her face. It carried the same sound she'd heard the night she left her people, a promise in motion, the whisper of something eternal. "Sometimes," she said softly, "what looks like the end is just where the miracle begins." Silas looked out at the open land, at the horses resting near the fence, the crops bending in the breeze, the faint glimmer of the mountains that once took everything from them. He held his family close, his voice low, steady, and sure. "The wind started here," he said, "and it's still carrying your story." As the night deepened, Red Mesa breathed, alive again, free again. And beneath the same stars that had once watched her despair, Akacheta smiled, knowing that her life, her love, and her child were proof that even the hardest soil could bloom when tended with faith. The wind rose once more, curling through the barley and around the old porch, carrying her laughter across the desert, back toward the mountains where it had all begun.